You're listening to Inside the Village, where all news is local and no topic is off limits.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley. Hey, bully in the alley. So help me, Bob.
It's Inside the Village, episode number 4, across the Village Media platform, and of course, wherever you get your favorite podcast, be it Google, Apple, Spotify, you name it, we are there, and of course at InsideTheVillage.ca. Alongside Frisco, I'm Scott. Great to be back for another week, sir.
Great to see you, Scott.
Every time I go to one of our websites, it's 100% election coverage, and I am excited about what's coming up in the next few weeks.
Oh, it's a lot going on, and you know, as our readers would know, if they go to their sites right now, the Ontario Vote section on the homepage of every site has everything they need to know about their local candidates, the local issues that are making news. Anything election related, that's the place to go. Just so people know, we've asked all of the party leaders to come on the show here and talk to us about what they have in store for Ontario voters if they are voted in as the next government. We haven't heard back with confirmation days from any of them yet, but they say they're working on it. You are also interviewing Kathleen Wynne on the next episode of your Up Close and Personal show. That'll be something.
Yeah, looking forward to that. And in doing the research, you know, what a difference a few years makes from 2014 when she and the Liberals won a majority government to 2018 when the party lost its official party status. So that's going to be a great chat, and you can look forward to seeing that across the Village Media Network as well. Speaking of election, great show. We're going to continue in that vein and talk about the environment and climate change as it relates to the election. Also, they say that fences make good neighbors. We'll head to North Bay and find out if that is in fact true. And a Guelph company doing some very meaningful work for the Department of National Defense. We'll find out what that's all about. But first, the first word to Frisco and a new member to the Village family. Some could say that we've added some Village people.
Absolutely. You know, we're very excited this week. We launched our 17th local news website in Ontario, StratfordToday.ca, serving the great community of Stratford. Just a lot of excitement around here for this launch. We're excited about all our launches, especially about this community. There's a lot of people that care passionately about the city they live in, and I think Stratford Today is going to be a wonderful place, a wonderful thing serving that community. We have Paul Clough, a veteran journalist who's our new editor there. He's fantastic. We have Conchita Galvez, who's a very talented reporter who's working for us there as well. So we have a great team in place. And they're just going to do fantastic things. We have high hopes. And, you know, speaking of the great work our local journalists do, we have to also mention that our fantastic team in Barrie at BarrieToday.com nominated for a Digital Publishing Award for their fantastic work on last year's tornado that hit the region. The team with Marge Bruneman, Bob Bruton, Nikki Cole, Sean Gibson, and their fearless leader, the editor over there in Barrie, Raymond Bowe, just did a fantastic job, and they made us all look good without a nomination for sure.
All right, thanks, Frisco. The first word to Frisco. Coming up in our first segment of Inside the Village, another hot-button election issue, the environment and climate change. We'll find out more right after this.
From newsmakers to celebrities to other prominent guests, you'll find them all on Village Media's new interview series, Up Close and Personal. Join host Scott Sexsmith as he goes one-on-one with well-known Canadians to hear their story. Up Close and Personal. Look for it on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Welcome back to Inside the Village. Scott and Frisco here. You know, a couple of hot-button issues as the election approaches. We addressed one with Tim Hudak a couple of episodes ago, the housing prices and inflation and all that. Now, let's make the shift to environment and climate change equally as important.
For sure. It does feel like that issue maybe fell off the table a little bit in the last couple of years. Everybody was focused on COVID, and then kind of on our way coming out of COVID, we're dealing now with soaring prices all across the board. Inflation is the big issue. But it really is still one of the most important issues, and one that people care about, and one that the parties have to have a plan. They need to have an answer to voters who grill them about what we're going to do about the environment, how we're going to tackle climate change.
We're joined now by the program director of the Environmental Defense Organization, Keith Brooks. Keith, welcome to Inside the Village. Appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I think I'd like to start, Keith, if I can, by quoting some verbiage from the mission statement, and then we'll get into to a few questions. Your vote can change the future by electing a government that will fight climate change, promote sustainable development, tackle pollution, and restore protections for natural areas and endangered species. So let's get the obvious first question out of the way, if we can, from a strictly environmental perspective. How would you grade the Ford government's performance in this area?
Just before we get into things, I just have to make it clear that Environmental Defense is a charity, and as we can't do any partisan activity. So, I'm happy to talk about the issues, happy to talk about the government's track record. But I just wanted to be clear to you guys and to the listeners, there are some lines I need to respect.
For sure.
This government's track record on the environment has been abysmal, to put it in a word, really, right? I mean, they've taken us backwards on climate change quite considerably. They've loosened protections for endangered species, are planning massive projects that are going to have huge impacts on species habitat. They're also railroading communities and pushing people into more sprawl using these minister zoning orders. I mean, it's been quite destructive, actually.
Let's start with climate change, Keith. Forget the Ford government for a minute. Where should we be at? I mean, if I'm talking to my candidate today, my local candidate, what should I be asking them to be at in terms of where we need to be on climate change?
Well, we need a government that takes climate change seriously and has a real plan to fight climate change. With the previous government of Ontario had a pretty good system in the cap and trade program. They had a strong target to reduce emissions by 37% from 1990 levels. The current government has a target to reduce emissions by 30% from 2005 levels. And this stuff is all gobbledygook with the different targets and the dates and all that kind of stuff. But the gist of it is that we need a government that takes the issue seriously, that is committed to drastic emissions reductions, and has, a bunch of policies in place to get at all the major sources of emissions in the province.
Mm-hmm. I feel like as an informed voter and a relatively informed person, I feel like I understand the issues fairly well. I read about them as best I can. And then COVID hit, right, Keith? And COVID comes along. We've spent the last 2 years stuck in this rut. Now we're coming out of it, and everyone's talking about inflation and the cost of living going through the roof. Do you kind of feel like this issue's, I don't want to say it's gone more to the back burner, but is it harder to get people's attention on this with all that's been going on the last couple of years?
It is harder for sure. And people have been concerned with the healthcare system, and they're concerned about affordability. And all of these things are real concerns as well. But the climate crisis has not gone away. And we do get periodic reminders of the severity of this crisis. Those reminders for us here in Canada usually come in the summer. You'll remember last summer, this heat dome in BC, it killed, I think, 70 people. And then that was followed by this atmospheric river that caused this massive torrent and wiped out the highways and left people stranded, really, right? So we're going to get reminders of climate change. The crisis has not gone away. Unfortunately, it can fade a little bit into the background when more pressing issues like, illness and affordability are at play.
No, you're right. I feel like climate change sometimes is a lot like COVID in the sense that, there's a significant percentage of the population. I feel like when I talk to people, they're just not going to believe that this is a problem that they need to confront, that this is an issue that we need to be on top of. Do you find that, or what do you say to people who just say, you know what, Keith, I just don't think this is as big of a deal as it should, as you're saying it is?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like people not, reading enough about what the scientists are saying, not following events, or skeptical about the ties made between the impacts of climate change and the causes of climate change. And I guess there's also a third level of, or a new kind of variant of climate denialism, which is one that says, well, we know it's happening, but there's nothing we can do about it. And I think all of that is really tough. But, Canadians, around COVID, Canadians are quite actually compliant on the main, right? We have a high vaccination rate globally. People did a good job of staying inside and doing what they're asked for by their governments. And on climate, same thing goes, actually. The vast majority of Canadians believe climate change is happening. They know what the major causes are. They want governments to do more. But I think it's just that we're not feeling the real urgency around the climate crisis. And that's the piece that we really need to get the kind of action that we need, the aggressive action that we need to reduce emissions quickly and kind of really strive for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, which is what the global climate community is striving for.
Absolutely. And again, this is a totally dumb question, Keith, but I think there are some people who really don't understand why it's important to tackle climate change, to keep the planet from warming at the rate it is. Why is it so important? I mean, that's the dumbest question I can ask you, but I really think there's a segment of people that don't understand that.
Well, if the climate warms too much, we're going to have more extreme weather events, more of these forest fires that have become a recurring issue in many parts of the world. We're preparing for more of a fire regime here in Ontario too. And then we also, although it sounds odd, also get a lot more floods because the atmosphere is hotter and it can hold more water, and it changes the way that weather patterns work. And we get a lot more damage from these extreme weather events. We also get rising sea levels. And, the IPCC looked at it and they said, if we had 2 degrees of warming as opposed to 1.5 degrees of warming, that means hundreds of millions more people are going to be put in harm's way. They're going to be impacted by rising sea levels, by severe droughts, by agricultural food shortages, all kinds of things. I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before, actually. And we're kind of moving slow-mo into this crisis, right? The scientists are telling us it's there, and we're just not pumping the brakes like we need to be.
Keith, we have a lot of listeners, a lot of readers in the Bradford area, right, in Simcoe County. A lot of people talking about the Bradford bypass. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we don't support it. Mm-hmm. The Bradford bypass would go through the Holland Marsh, which is a provincially significant wetland. There's some other important historical areas there as well that the Bradford bypass will probably destroy. I don't think that there's any evidence to support that a highway like that, whether it's the Bradford bypass or the 413, is going to do anything to alleviate congestion. We know these new roads just get filled up with new cars, and it's going to put a lot more pressure on the arterial roads as well, bringing a lot more people through, the communities that the people don't want through there. And it's going to have more people in cars, more pollution. There's more issues around salt. We use a lot of salt on our roads. That salt's going to get into Lake Simcoe, into the Holland Marsh, into the species habitat there. And then the other thing is that the government's planning on using this 27-year-old environmental assessment, really, right? Like going back to how we thought about the environment back in the 90s. And things have changed a lot since then. And I think we really do need an updated assessment to figure out what are the real impacts of this highway and what should be done to mitigate them.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, this is a very specific question, but we also have a big presence in Northern Ontario, and a lot of people are talking about the electric arc furnace that Algoma Steel is building. Is that an issue you're aware of that you can talk about?
Yeah, I think that's a great initiative. There are some of these hard to decarbonize sectors, and cement and steel, and some of these other ones are tough nuts to crack when it comes to climate change, but they're producing materials that we still need in our society, really, right? And if we want to be building public transit, we want to be building, good, dense cities, we're going to need steel, and we need cement and concrete, and we need those kind of materials. So we have to figure out how to make them in a low carbon way. And this move away from coal and towards the electric arc furnaces is a great way to go. And I know some folks were concerned that this move was going to hurt jobs in Sault Ste. Marie. But our perspective is that this is really about protecting jobs. This is about making sure that there's a steel industry that's part of a low carbon economy, and kind of, increasing the competitiveness of that industry as carbon pricing goes up, as people get more and more worried about climate change. I mean, this is a great technological shift that they made there in the Sioux, and they're making in Hamilton as well.
Keith, I want to go back if I can. You mentioned that you have kids, and of course Frisco has kids, as do I. And we talk about leaving the planet in a respectable shape for our grandchildren for years to come. If you were to fast forward, what do you think our grandchildren will say about how we handled this issue?
Well, it depends on if you're going to put your optimistic hat on or your pessimistic hat on, but what I think people should be worried about is if we don't manage this crisis, and that things get worse and we end up with, fires and floods and droughts and agricultural shortages. If we end up with a migrant, kind of crisis like that is many, many times worse than what we're already living through today. That people are, the kids, or that they'll be older then, but at that point they're going to turn to that older generation and say, how could you let this happen? What did you do when you knew this was coming? Because it's not as though there won't be any evidence of all of the scientific reports that came forward and told us that we needed to act on this. The blood will be on our hands, those of us who didn't act or didn't do anything to stop this crisis from unfolding. And I think that's an outcome that I would really much like to avoid.
Keith, you talked about the political line you can't cross, so I guess it would be an unfair question for me to ask who you're going to vote for in June.
Yeah, I can't say who I am going to vote for at all. But, we are trying to get people to vote for the environment. This is a critical election when it comes to the environment for Ontario. It's critical around climate policy for this province. We're in a critical decade to fight climate change between now and 2030. Whoever goes to power at Queen's Park is going to be in power for the next 4 years, so until 2026. That's going to have a big impact on this province's contributions to the crisis or to the solution, hopefully. And then, around urban sprawl and land use planning as well, right? The government wants to open up a lot more land for development. And once you open that land up, you cannot take it back. It's done. It's like squeezing the toothpaste out of the tube. You just can't put it back in. And so, it's really high stakes here. And I would encourage people, we've got some information on our website. There's other information we can put out there. People can get informed about the environment, what's at stake, and really I hope that people do vote with the environment in mind.
Keith, thanks so much. Is there anything we didn't ask you that you think you need to get across? We have listeners all over the province.
No, I would go, if you can, go to, yourstoprotect.ca, and you can find a lot of information there about a number of the environmental issues at stake. You can go to environmentaldefense.ca, that's our website, and find out information there. Or if you want to see a comparison of where the parties are at on their environmental platforms, you can go to greenprosperity.ca, and there's a comparison up there. So yeah, get educated, get out and vote. Critical election right here.
Yeah, it sure is, and things are heating up, and it'll be interesting, Keith, to see where things land come June 2nd when Ontarians go to the polls to cast their vote. Keith Brooks from Environmental Defense, thanks for doing this today. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Frisco, our next segment on the show, I'm reminded of the expression, fences make good neighbors, but not always, and a story out of North Bay speaks to just that.
Yeah, classic controversial local story. A fence goes up, and people are upset about it, and we're going to try to get to the bottom of it.
And we will, next on Inside the Village.
She had my heart, oh, very nearly.
For the latest in in-depth features and enterprise journalism from your local writers at Village Media, be sure to check out The Big Read. The Big Read, it's the full story behind the headlines. Look for The Big Read on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley.
We're now joined on Inside the Village by BayToday.ca reporter Stu Campaigne. Stu, great to have you on the show, and nice to finally see you face to face after all this time.
Thanks very much, guys. I'm glad to be here.
Now, I got to tell you a little backstory. I'm from North Bay, and I just told you before we started that I'm a West Ferris Trojan alumni, and as luck would have it, you just live around the corner from the school. What a small world.
That's right. Thanks. Well, I do have some fans, so I don't want to divulge the exact address, but yes, I am very close.
I think we did something dangerous just there.
That's right.
I'm worried, Stu. You may have to move.
And we should mention we can't afford security detail on this show. It's a very low-budget production, yes. So it's great to have you, but you're on your own, Stu.
Yeah. Speaking of security, Stu, kind of a good segue to the question. You got a tip last year about a fence that was built in the west end of North Bay. Can you tell us about it? What is this? What's going on with this fence?
Okay, so first let me preface all this by saying that this is a real kind of multifaceted story, and I think that's why it's had such legs. It's been really going since October, and I have to say, without taking any sides, it's a testament to these neighborhood folk who have really just kept at it for all these months and kept the story in the media. They've taken their case to City Hall, and now they're progressing down. Instead of finding out why it happened, they want to just find a solution. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it resonates with people. So basically, the story goes, there's a spot in North Bay off of Main West, which follows along the lake here, Lake Nipissing, and one of the lakes here, I should say, but the main lake. And there are points along that strip where you can't get to the lake because it's been built up, it's private property, whatever the case may be. But there is, as far as we know, for decades, been this access where people have just used it as a place to, and yes, it is private property and there are train tracks there. And it's beautiful down there. There's a trail down to the beach. If you came from a place that wasn't as beautiful as here, you would think this is heaven. It really is gorgeous. And it's good and so these people in the neighborhood, one of the main concerns they have is it is really part of their active lifestyles. Lots of retired folk down in that area and senior citizens who, for them, they claim, and I'll say they have a pretty good case, when that access is blocked off by this fence, it's a real long way to get around to get to the lake. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what this is all based on. So basically the end of last summer and throughout the summer of 2021, this access kind of also had been taken over by some unhoused people who were living in encampments along the trails, along the rail lines. And to be frank, it may not happen in that area every year, but it happens every year along that strip. Mm-hmm. So to make the long story short, there is a gymnastics club right there at the intersection of 10th Street and Jet Avenue. The gymnastics club's parking lot opens up onto the rail lines and then onto the beach and down the trails. And there were concerns from parents at that club about the homeless people kind of scavenging in the area, but approaching, I don't think there were real threats of violence, but just people felt uneasy.
Is the rail company put up the fence, Stu?
So we think now no one's ever confirmed, but we believe this city councillor, because the rail, the problem area, so to speak, is not city property, approached the railway. And, this is something they probably should have done 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden now they've decided that the solution is the fence.
So all of a sudden, the residents of that area who walk through there all the time go there one day, and there's a kilometer-long fence there.
I was there the first day, and you should have seen the people. You should have seen the looks on their faces. It was it really was. And this is another thing. Looking back at it, I don't think anyone thought this was going to be a big deal. But they really there should have been some kind of consultation at the very least with the residents and the nearby businesses who've, all dealt with this problem from a different kind of perspective.
Yeah. And now that the summer's coming, Stu, as the lobbying ramped up, the petition efforts, the residents knowing that the summer's coming, they won't be able to access the beach through this way.
Yeah. I mean, since we last left the story until this most recent letter of the editor from Ms. Stang, it was kind of before Christmas. It was the last council meeting. The last thing the group was supposed to go to the railway itself and try to work out some kind of deal, but also broach the subject of this railway safety funding that they could get to make or create a safe railway crossing and get it opened up again. So that's kind of where we are in the whole, the timeline right now.
We're pleased now to be joined on Inside the Village by Ursula Stang, a North Bay resident who is involved with the West End Neighborhood Association of North Bay. Ursula, thank you for joining us on Inside the Village today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Ursula, for coming. We've been talking to Stu Campaigne from BayToday.ca about the fence. I just want to ask you the first obvious question is, what was it like when you walked in there and you saw it for the first time? You must have been shocked.
Well, I knew that it was going to be there because I saw a picture in the paper. Mm-hmm. But it was there from one day to the next, and yes, it's been quite shocking. People were quite upset, and even now, how many months later, 6 months later, I guess, it's still upsetting.
Ursula, can you talk about what it was like before this fence went up? People in the neighborhood would just walk across the tracks and go right to the beach?
That as a trail, it's been marked on city maps for, I think someone told me, about 70 years. It's marked as not an official access to the beach, but it's marked as a trail on recreational type maps as a way to get to the beach. It was never official. We're hoping to rely on a bit of common law property rights because it's been used for so long. Mm-hmm. People use it every day. People carry their toys down, their kayaks, canoes, their kids, their dogs. I went down there personally at least 4 or 5 times a week.
Ursula, can you tell us where things stand now with the organization? Obviously, you wrote a letter to us raising some concerns, but in terms of the process and next steps, where are things currently sitting?
Well, back in December, 2 of us, not myself personally, but 2 of us met with the OVR to ask them about what could be done. And they sympathized, and they recognized that it was an impediment for us, but they said the ball is in city council's court, that city council would have to designate it a pedestrian crossing, and then OVR would respond to that.
Have you been told, Ursula, there's some people arguing and saying, well, look, you can just walk around the fence and get to the other side? Are people telling you that?
Yes, of course. There are a lot of people saying, what's wrong with you? Just drive down to the beach or just walk the long way, But I'm in my 70s, and there are a lot of elderly people in this neighborhood. It's an old neighborhood. And it's an extra kilometer along a road that isn't often very well plowed in the winter. And it just adds a kilometer to my particular loop that I do. So it's a 20-minute loop if that I used to do. And now it's 35 minutes and not as pleasant. For sure. You've been in this fight now for a few months. How optimistic are you that you might be able to make some headway and get this fence taken down? Well, obviously I have some optimism, or I wouldn't have written the letter to Mr. Rhoda. I'm hoping that members of council will read it as well and maybe push for that, especially in an election year. Maybe they'd be interested in doing something. Yeah. Stu Campaigne is with us, Ursula. He's our reporter on BayToday.ca. He's done a fantastic job covering this story for a long time. Yes, Stu, did you have any questions, Stu, or anything we're not thinking of?
Well, I just to kind of piggyback on what Ursula said is, I think the real danger here is this council is going to dissolve, and there's a deadline for this funding, and I believe it's in August sometime. Ursula, am I correct? I tried to find that information this morning because I thought that might come up, but I'm not positive. But it could be August. It is August. So basically, that council will go. Although they technically run till November. They could be in lame duck status, or they could be just, kind of playing out the string. So this has to happen in the next few weeks. It really does. Can you explain that quickly to us, Stu? What funding is this we're talking about? So there's a federal program called the Railway Safety Improvement Plan. I believe that's what it's called, RSIP. And this funding is available to help build safe crossings over railways. So what the group would do is apply. The city has to apply for the funding. The federal government would grant the funding, and then they would have they would take the fence down or open the fence, and they would have a pathway through to the beach.
Ursula Stang, North Bay resident from the West End Neighborhood Association of North Bay, and Stu Campaigne from BayToday.ca. Thank you both for joining us on Inside the Village today. Thank you so much for inviting me. Frisco, I don't know about you, but something tells me we have not heard the last out of North Bay in that story. You're definitely right. I think we're going to see a lot more reporting from Stu. There's going to be something he's going to keep on covering, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more letters to the editor coming in, too. Absolutely. Up next, our third and final segment on Inside the Village. We head to Guelph, Ontario to learn about a company that is doing some very meaningful work for the Department of National Defence. That's next on Inside the Village.
Reporters, editors, and journalists who go the extra mile to get the story and get it right. Go behind the scenes with those who cover the stories that matter most to you and your community. Look for it in the Village Features section of your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
We're back on Inside the Village alongside Michael Friscolanti, Editor-in-Chief of Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. I was on Guelph today the other day and saw a very interesting story about a company in Guelph that is doing some meaningful work for the Department of National Defence that involves identifying remains of soldiers. It's a fascinating story. The Department of National Defence has a long-standing program to help identify the remains of soldiers who were killed in the First, Second World War and in the Korean War. And there's more than 27,000 unidentified remains, which is just mind-boggling when you think about it. So there's been various companies over the years that have tried to use DNA analysis to identify some of these remains to give them a proper burial. And now the contract has been awarded to a laboratory in Guelph. So a fascinating local story doing some amazing work. Joining us now on Inside the Village is Benoit Baudouin and Caitlin LeMay from the Wyndham Forensic Group in Guelph. Thank you both for joining us on Inside the Village today. It's nice to have you.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having us.
I'd like to start, if we can, maybe by telling us how the contract with DND all came to be.
Sure. So like any government contract, it went to tender, and then any willing party applies, and you put together your bid and put together all your credentials and how you could do whatever they're asking in this case for the casualty identification program. And then it goes through a grading process, and one party gets picked to sort of do the job.
So Benoit, are you the only company doing it right now?
We're the one who has the contract with the Department of National Defense, yes. Yeah.
But there's been various other ones in the past?
Yeah, there's been other companies before who have done this work, and it's sort of passed along.
Okay. Can you tell us a bit about the program? It's been around since 2007. What do you understand about the kind of work they've done since then, and what the goal is?
Sure. So the Casualty Identification Program is what it's called, and it works to identify recently discovered skeletal remains of Canadian service personnel that fell during the First, Second, or Korean Wars, in order to repatriate them and give them a proper military burial. So obviously, as you can imagine, there's many steps to that, and we really come in at the DNA piece with the identification. But yeah, and as you said, it's been around since 2007, and they've done some identification so far. I'm not sure the exact number off the top of my head, but yeah.
Can you help us non-scientists? Can you walk us through how it works? Do they send you a DNA sample, or do you do that? How does that work?
Sure. So usually the remains will be uncovered. New ones will be uncovered. From what I've heard, it's usually things like new construction where soil is being unearthed, and they'll come across remains. Then once it's sort of identified that these might be of Canadian roots, the Department of National Defense will come in, and they'll go over there, find whatever remains they can, and send them back to us in Canada. And then, we'll go ahead and it varies case by case what type of analysis we might want to do. But that's sort of the initial recovery process.
Mm-hmm. Caitlin, if I can go to you for a second, and a bit of a two-parter here. First of all, how long is the contract, and can you walk us through the process itself? I'm guessing it can be lengthy to identify the remains.
For sure. Ben can probably answer the first one a little bit better. I'm more of the DNA scientist portion, whereas Ben is a little bit more the business side. So I'll let him answer the first one.
So the way the contract works, it's up to 5 years. So we have an initial year, and then there's sort of 4 extensions to that. So it'll be up to 5 years.
Okay, great. Now let's dip into the science side of things, Caitlin, and I'll do my best to follow along and not ask any dumb questions.
Oh, no, there's no dumb questions.
There are from Scott.
So basically, when we receive the bone, what we'll do is we'll take a cutout from it. So this involves like using a saw to take a little portion of the bone. And what we do then is make it into a powder. So we use something similar to a blender, an appliance with blades to make it into a nice powder. And then from the powder, we actually separate the cellular material from like the cellular material that we don't want from the DNA. And then we take the DNA and we can do a couple of different analyses on it. So we can look for nuclear DNA. So that's DNA that's found in the nucleus of your cell, and without getting too bogged down by the science, but that's your DNA. So that's what makes you you. It's the blueprints of life. There's other analyses that we can do. So that's mitochondrial DNA. So we have 2 sets of DNA as humans. So there's the nuclear DNA that's found, like I said, in the nucleus, but then there's also mitochondrial DNA. And that's DNA found specifically in your mitochondria. So we can use the mitochondrial DNA to also identify people. And that's normally helpful because there's a lot of copies of mitochondrial DNA in a cell, whereas there's only 1 set of nuclear DNA in a cell. So the mitochondria is it's easier to get, especially with these older, more degraded samples.
How rewarding is this kind of work, Caitlin? I guess I can ask you. I mean, this is a very serious issue. We're identifying the remains of fallen Canadian soldiers who served our country, fought for our freedoms. How rewarding is it to do this kind of work?
it's unbelievably rewarding. Absolutely. It's so interesting that we are able to help in sort of this, what it might seem a small way, but it's absolutely amazing. Yeah.
When you identify that, when you do the DNA work, you have to then compare it to somebody else, right? To find a family member. How do you know who you're looking for? Is there a database of some kind that has a whole bunch of families of Canadian soldiers?
Sure. So that's mostly lies with the Department of National Defense. They have a manifest of, all the soldiers who went over and fought. And so depending on where the remains are found, they'll narrow down a list of potential candidates. And then they'll go collect reference samples from them.
Okay. And what happens once you do have a match? The goal is to get these remains home and given a proper burial for the families?
Exactly, yeah.
And you expect, and again, an unfair question, I think, but do you expect that could happen in the next few months with one of your samples?
We're hoping as soon as possible, like we said, with a couple quick identifications. It does take, particularly with mitochondrial DNA, it takes a long time to sort of work through these samples. They're done one at a time very carefully. And so, let's say within the next six months to a year, we're hoping to have some identifications.
We covered this story in Guelph Today. Our reporter, Santana Bellantoni, did a nice piece about your company in GuelphToday.com. What do the people of Guelph think of what you're doing? Do they know that you're doing this kind of important work in their city?
Yeah, we've gotten some great feedback. We've posted, that story and the news on LinkedIn and Twitter. We have those, and we've gotten some great comments and feedback from that, stating, it's a great project, and we're happy to be supporting our very own Department of National Defense. And so, yeah, it seems like we've gotten some really great feedback from the community.
It certainly is a great project and honorable work that the two of you are doing. So thank you for that, and thank you for doing this today. Benoit Baudouin and Caitlin LeMay from Wyndham Forensic Group in Guelph. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And that puts a wrap on another episode of Inside the Village. I can't get over how fast these shows fly by, and it's great, interesting content that our editorial departments and reporters all across the province are putting together. And based on the response that we see across Ontario, it's being well received.
I think so, and I think the best example I can give you is, I have to tell this story. I can't not. I was at my desk the other day, and there was a knock on the Village Media door, and they said someone's at the door to see you. And I look over, and it's my old friend Carm DiGregorio from Hamilton. We went to the same high school together. We actually went to journalism school together. Very talented guy, great journalist. He left journalism after a while to pursue bigger and better things, but he was in Sault Ste. Marie for his daughter's basketball tournament. He wanted to knock on the door and say hello. I haven't seen him in about 20 years. I gave him a big hug. We had a great time catching up with each other. And the one thing he kept saying to us was how much he was enjoying the podcast. And I'd say, come on, Carm. I mean, you don't have to say that. I mean, we're buddies. You don't have to tell me how great it is. But he really enjoyed it. And then, of course, you happened to walk by. He met you. I think he had a little bit of a celebrity crush. Oh my God, it's Scott Sexsmith. But we had a great time. So at least one guy is listening to the show.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to meet him and give him a tour of the studio, and it was great. It was just as much a thrill for us as I think it was for him.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm encouraging all our listeners to come by the office. I'm not sure that's what I'm saying, but it was great to see Carm.
I don't think we have that much security detail. Frankly, I don't think we need that much security detail. So. But that's a story for another episode. Thanks, man. We'll do it again next week. Looking forward to it.
Me too. Thanks, Scott.
Inside the Village, as always, available across the Village Media platform and wherever you get your favorite podcast, of course, and at InsideTheVillage.ca. We'll talk to you next week. For Michael Friscolanti, I'm Scott Sexsmith.
You've been listening to Inside the Village.